Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our biennial coffee chat, Public Memorials and Social Memory. We're so grateful to have you here today for artists and curators, memorial scholars on the role of public memorials and art for building social memory and a space for collective healing. This conversation is in conjunction with our America's COVID-19 Memorial Project, an artist-driven memorial project to acknowledge the grave impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the Americas. Over the next 6 months, we will be inviting commissioned artists and the public to submit memorial drawings to be featured in a virtual exhibition that will offer opportunities to explore how the artistic imagination conceives of a memorial to this contemporary tragedy. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker in this event, Colorado Poet Laureate Bobby Lefebvre, who will be reading an original poem here today that has never been read before. So excited to welcome Bobby.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Flora Jane and Robin and the Biennial of the Americas for inviting me to offer an invocation of sorts for today's chat and to set the stage for this very, very necessary project. Today's panel is an incredible assembly of brilliant minds, and I'm blessed to be among you. As a poet, it is a huge honor to be given the opportunity to attempt to language what is impossible to find language for. I wrote for an entire year about the pandemic, about people, about life, about loss, hope, despair, and the following poem marks the end of that pandemic writing journey for me. So this poem is a burial of sorts, but it's also a birth, right? Because after all, we're always just coming and going anyway. So this reading is dedicated to the memory of everyone we have lost and the resilience of those of us who remain, albeit changed forever. The title of this poem is Here Where We Are the Flowers. One day, the globe is spinning. We are smiling or not. Mundane or magic normalcy walks on 2 feet. Autopilot guides our way. Things are the way we know them to be. New lovers braid their fingers together for the first time as the sun sets. The Zócalo is full. The mercado is loud and abundant. The city is a body living and breathing. We go about our day. The cumpleañera blows out her birthday candles. We hug our grandmothers with reckless abandon. Every seat at the dinner table is full of friends and family. We are laughing, mouths flung open, words unapologetically traveling upon the wind. Vivacity abounds. The next day, the globe stops. Together we furrow our brow, stumble off kilter, our hearts become ticking time bombs, panic begets panic, all of us running in place. The unknown tethers itself to our collective consciousness, our psyche, a lone wolf howling at the moon. We retreat. Replace wings with worry, trade the social for the solitary, make an enemy of touch. Distance becomes our God. 6 feet apart, running away from 6 feet under. We forget how to look each other in the eye. Survival becomes a dreary song we play on repeat, our hands chapped from reading one too many headlines. Then slowly, together, we attempt to construct a new language, knowing words like our leaders are failing us. We begin to speak in statistics, but here the numbers are lives, the percentages are people. Meanwhile, the curve is rising. The crescendo, a destination uncharted. The corporeal try and coax their jettisoned souls back into their bodies, and there are so many bodies. Blood, bones, flesh, wrinkles, birthmarks, tattoos, dimples, eyes, scars. Existence is upended, a hemisphere uprooted, the earth confused by all the graves here where land is acknowledged but never returned. Grief morphing into trauma, collective mourning, curses shouted toward the heavens, candles lit where life should be. How did we become bygone? We've all lost something, found ourselves digging for unknown things in places we have never been, territory uncharted, jutting emotions, a compass pointing in the directions we have never traversed, anguish operationalized, but they who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Let us return to the circle, this holy hoop of hope that is unending. Let us lick each other's wounds, offer one another the medicine of mutual aid. Let our mourning morph into ritual. Let our grief be a tender mercy. Let these tears be libation. Let us become the altar, something living, something unfixed, something capable of transforming. Let us be both the memory and the imagination, the stewards of bridging yesterday to tomorrow. Let us remember so that we never forget. And here at this monument, this memorial embodied, we will learn to harness and activate our anger, channel and transform our anxiety. Here we will exist unafraid to sit in our sadness, to allow for it to fester until it transmutes into healing. Let our bruises become a balm. Let our gaping wounds become mouths that translate the pain. It is okay to not be okay. Let us bathe in our brokenness, evolve in our emptiness, faith keeping us forward facing. And in this place we see but have yet to arrive upon, let us create new meaning, social reconstruction in our hands here at this human memorial, at this monument in the flesh where we are the flowers, where we are the prayers. Let us say and remember all their names. Let us shout our own into the void so loudly that the unborn waiting somewhere in the cosmos will smile celestially and proud, and we will walk together across time and space with understanding and empathy, arms linked together, experience endured, healing and heard, and life will bend into tomorrow with promise. I promise. Thank you. I don't think we can hear you, Robin. I can't hear you.
Oh no, I was on mute. I'm so sorry. Thank you to my friends here for letting me know. Again, then I will say thank you to Bobby for reading us that lovely poem, and I apologize for the brief interlude of muteness. And I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists here who will be joining us for this conversation on public memorials and social memory. So I have 4 wonderful speakers joining us. We have Renee Ater, Courtney Lane Stell, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer, and Professor James E. Young, who will be our moderator. So without further ado, I will pass it off to them.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I come to this just as having written quite a bit and thought about memorials for about 35 years now. And I've also participated in several memorial processes, including the 9/11 Memorial, the Ruins Denkmal to the murdered Bureau. Worked with the Argentinian government on their memorial process for the desaparecidos, and find always that the process itself is just as important as a so-called final product. What I loved about Bobby's poem was this emphasis on the living, animated, unfixed memorial, because that's what memory is. And this whole contemporary generation of artists and architects is really now obsessed with unfixing the memorial and making the memorial as alive as the people it might be commemorating. So with that in mind, I think Robin wanted me to ask each of our speakers here, beginning with Renee and then Raphael and then Courtney, just to tell us a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll jump in with some kind of open questions. Renee?
So thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. So I have for the last decade been working on a project entitled Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past, Race Memorialization and Civic Engagement. It has mutated over time, but one of the things that I have been really interested in documenting the memorial landscape through an open source platform called Ameka, and writing about these monuments in Scalar, another open source publishing platform. I started the project 10 years ago, and when I first started it, I actually remember distinctively, an art historian said, "Why are you working on that material? There's nothing to be done." And I said, "Well, actually, there's a lot of work to be done. And we can't always have the conversation about Confederate monuments. We need to actually shift that conversation into talking, I think, very deeply about this historical both legacy and problem of slavery in the United States. So that is what I'm working on. I have a database now of about 107 monuments, and I'm in the process of writing a digital publication about some of the monuments.
Thank you. Rafael.
Hi, so I'm a Mexican artist who has been working for about 20 years in public art. Perhaps the works that I'm most interested in is in those that deal with dire circumstances. Pretty much all the public artists that I admire, people like Rachel White-Reed or Hans Hakas or Krzysztof Odishko, make their strongest work when in the context of duress or mourning. And I got opportunities to do that. So in the past couple of decades, I've been making memorials. For example, the memorial for the Tlatelolco student massacre in Mexico City, or lately a COVID memorial for the loss, which is an online project that anybody can visit right now. Is in the URL @crackinthehourglass.net. My projects depart from the conviction that a fundamental part of civilization is to be able to observe the passing of somebody. The wake, the process of mourning, the process of the speeches, the closure that we all need when dealing with death is a critical aspect that is no longer possible thanks to social distancing. It's a very common situation that people's father goes into the hospital, 3 weeks later he's dead, and you couldn't accompany him through that journey. And I think that is a very dire situation that we are faced with right now. Many people are going through this. So @crackinthehourglass.net is a project that tries to bring people together. Not unlike public space, the internet is a location where right now we're always behind the glass bubble of Zoom or a video conference. But is there a world where we can take the public space of the internet to create a sense of solidarity, a sense of loss, but also a sense of continuity? So A Crack in the Hourglass draws portraits sent by family members and friends of people who have deceased due to the COVID. And a robot arm draws their likeness very slowly with sand from an hourglass that has been cracked. And then that sand takes about 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, there's a robotic platform that tilts, gravity pulls the sand back, making the portrait disappear and recovering the sand for future portraits. So the idea is that if you go to the website now, you'll see hundreds of portraits already made. They're all made with the same little amount of sand. And that to me was important, to have that sense of continuity. So I've done many other memorial projects, but usually in the sense of not looking for a vampiric way to remember things as something that has been lost, but something that is an archive that can be performed for the concerns of today. So how can we remember things not passively, not nostalgically, but in relation to our current problems? So for example, my memorial for the massacre of students in Mexico was not just the playback of the voices of the student activists in '68, but also contemporary massacres that were taking place at this time. There's other examples of memorials, but we can talk about them in the discussion if you guys want.
No, thank you. Courtney.
Morning, everyone. I'm happy to join you this morning on the conversation. I'm a contemporary art curator. I've been so for about 15 years. And for the past 6 years, I've been running a nomadic nonprofit museum called Black Cube. And the idea for the organization is to sort of decentralize the experience of art and bring art directly to communities. and show art in context of communities. So there's a lot of ethics around the curating process and so on and so forth. We've done a few projects that directly relate to the conversation of monuments and memorials Black Cube has, and they're more specifically in the space of counter monuments, more like a call and response to existing monuments or a response to an unacknowledged history. So I'm really interested in conversations around the production of new art. I'm very interested in this dynamic conversation that's emerging around the ecosystem of public art and memorials and what's temporary, what's permanent, what's in the space in between. And I think I probably advocate for an ecosystem that's more dynamic, that has all of those things. Yeah. Thanks.
So you all remind me of the parts of memorials that I hate and the parts that I think the contemporary memorial designers get so well. Just like, Bobby had referred to those memorials that or memory being unfixed. And thinking specifically of COVID, one of its terrible cruelties is that it ended up, for a long time anyway, forbidding the communal memorialization of lost loved ones to COVID. As Raphael said, basically we're all in our little Zoom bubbles and unable just to reach out and give somebody a hug or to gather together, at the cemetery or to sit Shiva or to do any of the things that traditionally we've been able to do to work through this loss. And in response, I think some of the contemporary memorial makers have actually arrived at some media that allow the grieving families, in fact, to embody their grief, to work through it kind of durationally. For example, making these memorial cranes, as Carla Funderburg does, in LA, and others where they can tend a garden of memory that is durational, knowing that they've created a space where one day soon, we hope, grieving family members will be able to visit. And thereby to think of the kind of the America's COVID memorial as an ongoing matrix, evolving, gathering, kind of inclusive, open to including new memorials, open to losing memorials as well, acknowledging that just like any other human production, memorials have a kind of a durational life. Their beginnings, their genesis and thought and ideas, their execution and form, their life and reception, and occasionally their destruction, in fact, or their obsolescence, as they move themselves into history and out of sight. So by conceiving of the memorial in its stages, we get to think of it in its longue durée. So the memorial, has already begun, whether we wanted it to or not. Nobody had to, set off a kind of there was no starting point. There'll probably be no ending point, but we can acknowledge it as a long and sometimes painful, but sometimes very satisfying process. So this is kind of how I've begun, thinking about it. And when I sit down with kind of a government institution or a committee, sometimes they'll ask at the very beginning, can you just tell us what to do? We've never had anything like this, like in Norway for this horrible July 22 mass shooting by white nationalists, white supremacists in Oslo and this little island of Utøya. And my response was, they brought me there to kind of tell them what to do, but I said, I didn't come to tell you what to do. I came to keep you company as we figure it out. And it's already begun. No, you didn't have to set a starting point. It already began with the very first flowers laid in the street, by the parents and by the brothers and sisters that the kids lost. And it will be ongoing, and kind of set everybody's minds at ease to think of this as having already begun. Nobody's starting it, nobody's ending it. It's part actually of our living, breathing, personal memory of those we've lost.
I thought If I can just respond, I thought there was something also really powerful in Bobby's words about sitting in pain. And that part of, I think we often think of the memorial process or the monument as the end. And I like this idea that we are starting to think about the way in which Raphael talks, that this is an ongoing process. This is not like grief and mourning isn't pinned to like this thing that it's over and that we say it's done, and that mourning in public space can continue. One of the things that I wanted to mention is I run this memorial that actually is interesting enough tied to COVID, but is a memorial to the unarmed Black and brown peoples who've been killed by the police on Instagram. And I chose that site very specifically as a way to intervene, not only in the kind of color frame of Instagram and the way that people post there, but by using black and white, but as a disruption, so that we would remember that there's something else going on here, even as we try to negotiate our lives through COVID. And that is that BLM is happening at the same time, that the deaths are happening in this world at the same time, that we need to reconcile this kind of grieving and mourning through monuments and memorials.
Just to build off that a little bit, I also wonder about memorials and their relationship to death. I know that there's an important role with thinking about those that have passed, and there's an important role with continuing conversations intergenerationally. And I think memorials or monuments often do that. But I also wonder, just thinking about what Renee said, what else there is to memorialize in relationship to the COVID event. It's unearthed so many inequalities. It's showed so much resilience and strength. It, women have been largely impacted as well. So there's a gender inequality issue. There's also a lot of conversation around heroes, particularly in the medical profession. So I think those are interesting things to consider when we're considering what the impact and effect on this is. And then one last thought, just thinking about, James, maybe are there other monuments or memorials to mass pandemics? I believe I've done a little bit of research around the Spanish flu, and it seems like there's just a couple mentions on some plaques, but largely not, there's much more World War I memorialization, despite the death that we saw from the Spanish flu. And then interestingly, the Spanish flu actually being named Spanish flu because they were the only ones that covered it in press and publicly.
Right. It's there's a weird way in which commemorating the end of World War I was probably the greatest spreader event of all time for what they called the Spanish flu in Philadelphia. Some 50,000 people, I guess, flooded into the streets in Philadelphia and spread it throughout the city, and it led to tens of thousands of deaths when they thought they were commemorating the end of World War I. So this is this weird way in which the memorial collapses then into a pandemic, if you will, and elongates it, which is crazy.
I'm super interested in continuing Courtney's concern. What else can we memorialize from this current pandemic? One of them that really comes to mind is the fight against science and evidence-based thinking, right? I find it appalling how governments, from your government to my government in Mexico, to say somebody like Bolsonaro, talk against masks and talk against the evidence to further usually a nationalistic or ultra-right-wing agenda. To me, what's interesting is that very agenda, this idea of nationalism that is rising throughout the world, is precisely ill-equipped to deal with a planetary problem. So one of the things that we are being taught by COVID, something to remember, is what Buckminster Fuller said: we have planetary problems, we need planetary solutions. The fact is, even though there's a lot of disparity in who gets affected by COVID, the fact that it is a planetary engagement, much like climate change is going to be the crisis of our time, it's already the crisis of our time. It seems like we need to memorialize that this returns to a nationalism is not the right mode of operation to try and resolve these issues. So I would say that that's something to be thankful for. We're thankful that we can say things like, flattening the curve. Pretty much everybody now understands what flattening the curve is. This is a very important piece of information as we try and deal with an extinction event that is already here due to climate change. So I think that there are some things that we can look into that to try and memorialize and memorialize them as a process, as we've all sort of discussed, not as something that is to be looked at, retrospectively, but something about how we can project that into the future.
Right. Well, we have a couple of great models out there right now. Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, has now really led to a couple different things. One, memory in the service of justice, which is really interesting, but also the unvarnished memory. So he's commemorating not just the victims of lynching and racial terror, but he's commemorating the history of racial terror itself, as a foundational American set of events on whose back America was founded. And in the context of COVID, the founder of Marked by COVID, Kristen Okeza, who lost her father to COVID, and famously said that the only thing my father ever did wrong was to believe in what Trump told him, and didn't take the virus seriously, and it did kill him. And so she wants to make sure that memory now is as unvarnished and truthful as her experience tells her to be. So of course she mourns her father's loss, but she's also finding significance in it. The longer we get away from it, and just the sheer number of deaths that may not have been necessary, in fact, because of the handling of COVID, by the government and the anti-scientific, ideology, they came to bear on it.
Well, and if I can, I want to respond to all of you, but Courtney raised the first issue, and I think, how do you memorialize inequity? And this is a profound thing in relationship to the lack of access of African Americans, even in vaccinating in my own city, right? Like, who has priority, but how do we acknowledge there's deaths? And so there's a colleague of mine who's a digital humanist, Kim Gallen, who is at Purdue University in their College of Liberal Arts. And so one of the things that she's trying to do is to actually pull that data so we can see the disparity. And in some ways, that, although it's on a site, it's data, it is in fact trying to point to this issue of absence, like in really profound ways, but also to inequity. And so I see it as not a memorial, but it's trying to, in effect, it has a slightly memorial function by just pulling the numbers and extracting them and showing that there's this deep inequality in the way in which COVID treatment and access to testing, access to vaccinations have functioned, particularly in the United States.
Interesting.
And James, to speak to you on the Equal Justice Initiative, I think what's really interesting about this approach to it's a counter monument in my perspective, is that it's attached to an institution, and it's really attached to a sense of a living way to connect with living people, an institution that runs programs, that runs events, that sort of stimulates this space of remembrance. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really interesting model that's worth exploring more, especially when looking at such deep-rooted issues that many may experience directly in their life, but also have such historic roots.
I would agree completely. Raphael has tried to do this in his memorials too.
Absolutely. I love this idea of living way. How can the memorial be a living way? And the answer to me is make it like a radio program. So it's a platform for people to self-represent. It's a platform for people to bring in their memory, but then also their aspirations. So last year we made, 2 years ago, COVID year disappeared. In 2019, at the end, we made a project across the U.S.-Mexico border connecting the sister cities of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. And what we did is when I arrived, you guys, I had these notions of what I would do with Trump's wall. I could transform it, I could do this. And when I arrived, all the local stakeholders I met, artists and historians and so on, said, do not pay attention to the wall. Make a monument not about what separates us, but about what connects us. The interdependence, the cohabitation of these two sister cities over hundreds of years, even before the United States existed. So what we did is created these bridges of light that interconnected the two cities across the US-Mexico border, and that you can control with a little wheel. As you controlled it, the searchlight would scan the horizon, and when my searchlight and your searchlight would intersect in midair, automatically the people could speak to each other across the light. And if you didn't like what the person was saying, you could just tune him or her out and look for some other person, because there were 6 stations in total. Over the course of 2 weeks, we got tens of thousands of people joining each other at the border to have these conversations. We had serenades, we had mourning, we had families reconnect with each other through it. So on the subject of memorializing inequality, we're memorializing, but we're also trying to create the conditions for that to be not erased. Obviously, the wall is still there, but temporarily there's this moment where people feel like there is a continuity in the landscape. And what we saw is people flirting, and what we saw is people connecting with each other, bringing each other's into their cities. That's, I think, a valid way to do it, is create platforms as opposed to land a UFO that tells people what to think, is listen to them. How can a monument listen? That to me is the most important question. The answer is a monument probably won't be able to. So I really like Courtney's term, counter monuments. I've been calling my work anti-monumental for a really long time, because we're not interested in this sort of capture of, a dominant history, but we're interested in the minor histories and the relationships that can be established ad hoc, which are political. This is the micropolitics of participation. That I think is one way forward.
Yeah. The sense of opening the space in the landscape, that then opens the corresponding space within us, that allows something in us to change inwardly in our experience in the presence of a memorial. I mean, what happens is so much more than what we see in the landscape. And often, I mean, the contemporary artists are often interested in taking things away from the landscape to open space for us, so that we become the living, breathing, thinking memorials for which we search. And that ends up being one among the different classes of European counter monuments, in fact, where you counter the monument by countering all of its fixed pretensions and illusions, and kind of return the burden of memory to those who come looking for it, and really ask what happens inside people in the presence of these memorials.
Well, I think that gets to Raphael. Why I'm so intrigued by your project is this idea. Julian Bonder talks about this, who's a monument builder, but about the idea of the dialogic, right? So that there's this conversation that's constantly activated, and so that we are not just kind of looking up at the thing and trying to make meaning, that there's this absolute conversation you've created through light there. And for me, those are the most effective monuments. I actually think in the US, we could do what I call a monumental pause, and to say, why are we doing this? Why do we continue to put up bronze statues, particularly a lot of figurative work? What's the meaning of it? How is it addressing, monuments have this way of kind of fixing things. I think, James, you write that they're like, can be mere stones in the landscape. Well, I live in a city where there's a lot of mere stones and bronze in the landscape that no one engages. They drive by it, but they have no idea why the monumental landscape looks the way it does. So this idea of like the working memorial, the living memorial, the idea of the dialogic, I think is really important as we kind of move forward and think about actually these COVID memorials and how they might function in the future.
Sure. Courtney, did you have a...
Not per se, but I can always step in. Well, not always, sometimes. I think it's pretty interesting to think about them as living space. I've been pretty inspired by the Trafalgar Square Fourth Plinth project that was going on for a while, where, in the heart of London, in a very touristic city, the community couldn't decide what monument to replace. James, you can probably tell this way better than I can. And so instead of replacing a large plinth with a bronze statue, they decided to activate a program. And the program was to commission contemporary art that would rotate every so often. And they commissioned some pretty progressive artists that did performance-based work, some that did sculpture, but it created this sort of dynamic change in the sense of the public square. And it really, in certain ways, reactivated the public square. Because I think we're, particularly in the US, in a moment when public space is changing and shifting due to the internet, due to how we gather. And I think public ownership of space is part of the conversation of monuments and what is memorialized. So, I think that's the first thing top of mind. That
interesting. So I'm kind of curious, Raphael. So we brought up, I think Renee brought up Julian Bonder, who is Wodiczko's kind of partner and memorial partner. They've designed several things together and work well together. What kinds of conversations between and among artists are in play right now? I would just like to know for information's sake.
So, I mean, I really like Renee's call for a reprieve on building these monuments. We need to have this moment of poetry, and we need to have this moment of connection and performance. I have to tell you that I met Krzysztof Wodiczko, who is an artist that I've admired all my career. I've always aspired to be like him. I always thought that his work was very solemn, very striking, and very powerful. And I met him. In Spanish, we say mordiéndome el rebozo. It means biting my poncho. I came to him just like to talk to him like this. And then he became a dear friend. And we've been working some collaborations. It's interesting to me because his memory is for the memory of growing up in communist Poland, for example. So the question of assembly, which is a fundamental part of what he does and what I try to do, is it was put into question. In communist Poland, it was impossible for more than two people to meet in public space for an extended period of time over a particular distance because their assembly was seen as suspicious or unauthorized. So the question of the monument is really the question of, well, what is our own space of living? What is the democratic location where we can exchange information, where we can have shared experiences? So I think that the discussion, at least among the artists that I'm interested in, is definitely not about these monolithic sort of remembrance stones. I think that we're not seeing too much of that. What we are seeing is artworks that are out of control. I think that the single most important thing that the artist designing a monument should do is, first of all, acknowledge their own complicity with what they are denouncing, because we are being a part of a system that, we can't pretend to be outside and be pure. So the purity is gone. So acknowledge that. But most importantly, create the affordances for the public to be able to self-represent, as I said. And for that self-representation to not be censored or moderated, which is a very important part of what I've done in my work. Just as a funny anecdote, I made a project called Voice Tunnel in Park Avenue Tunnel. It wasn't a memorial, it was just like a fun piece where people could leave a message with an intercom and it would be created this archway of light that would add to all the previous ones. And you could hear what New Yorkers had said over the course of the day. NYPD came to me and said, Raphael, you're going to have to put a 6-second delay in everything that people say so that when we find something that's objectionable, we can delete it. And then I did a thing that as a Mexican I've always wanted to do because I've seen it in the movies. I said to the police, I said, this is America. And it is your job to protect freedom of speech. And in fact, they kind of understood that, and the whole project was uncensored and unmoderated. This is key, because if you're censoring, then the only message you're sending is one of censorship. 99.9% of the people who take the opportunity to participate say something funny or lofty or call outs, or they're beatboxers or their marriage proposals. What ends up happening, is there moronic content? Yeah, a little bit, but that's okay. If you're in a public park, you're going to hear some moronic content. But the important thing is that there's the agency of interaction happens through the monument in a way that the artist has no control over. And that is key, especially for its adoption into the future of a community that has to live with this thing every day. So already make it so that they can express themselves and already give them that ownership. That's the key thing, in my opinion.
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, just especially this notion that of agency, that returning agency to those who come to remember, as opposed to taking it away from them. And Renee's words, that big monolith that we just come up against, and that repels us basically.
James, sorry to interrupt you. Because I know of your work. I mean, I'm very interested. It seems like in the United States there's a tradition of walks. I really like that. I think that is a thing that we can take from the previous experiences that is really robust. Walking is EMDR, is bilateral stimulation. We're moving our body through the memory. So if I had to design a monument that was permanent, most of my work is ephemeral, but if I had to, it would probably involve that, I think what you called embodiment, where the body needs to be transposed over a landscape. And I think that's a very American thing. Maybe it's borrowed from Europe, I don't know, but it's I find that useful.
Well, it's become a preoccupation. I know that Maya Lin design of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was described in her presses, when she submitted the design. It was cutting, slicing into the earth and opening up a wound that will never heal. But then, in a very important insight, she said that I want to create not a fixed monument that you come face to face with, but a memorial. She said, makes you enter it and to leave it. That is, that you come into it and you move out of it. And so it's memory by means of perambulation. And that notion is picked up everywhere. I think the Memorial for Peace and Justice, that is a lynching memorial in Montgomery, absolutely, has that. So it's very much a narrative. And that walking embodiment is actually animated memory. It's walking and talking and walking and remembering all at the same time, as opposed to being fixed. The Denkmal in Berlin is all about that movement in and among the Stelae. And the landscapes remain fixed, but they need to be animated by those who move through it. And the memory is thus animated by moving through it as well.
That's so cool.
There's some conversation about engaging different senses with monuments. So this canonical approach to monuments being visual, being one that you don't touch, is kind of this phallocentric perspective of monuments and power, and that engaging other senses, creating experience, using touch, using other senses helps connect viscerally with your body, and so you feel the experience more. I also just wanted to raise a question that we talked about in our pre-chat, which was the space and difference between memorials and monuments, because the two terms are used so interchangeably. Any thoughts? Anyone?
Well, I raised the Maya Lin example, but that's one way to think about it. She really sees the monument as that traditional hard, fixed plastic thing in the landscape that needs to be animated and turned into a memorial, which is more of a living thing. So that's one way of thinking about it. I define the distinction traditionally as a monument can be a memorial, and a memorial can be a monument, but monuments side by side, the memorial is actually a subset of the idea of a memorial. The memorial can be a day of commemoration, could be a lighting a candle, can be a museum, can be a poem. It can also be a monument. But traditionally, that idea of the monument as a fixed thing against which you oppose the living memory, of people, has ended up defining this relationship, I think, between memorials and monuments. I mean, what are your thoughts on it, Renee?
I really like, James, how you phrase that. I have, in thinking about a physical, actual memorial, I do see them as tied to, and I think Maya Lin is so on point with this idea of the ongoing commemorative action that takes place there, that is embodied by individuals. And what's so astounding even today about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is that relationship of the body to the memorial, and how it has become a site still for veterans to go to, right, and to touch and to remember, and for me to go to touch and remember, right? Even though I'm born in 65, it still has tremendous meaning to me. I was actually thinking of this new memorial that is in Southern Maryland. It is at St. Mary's College, and it is called the Commemorative to the Enslaved Peoples of Southern Maryland. And what it does, first of all, it gets to Raphael's notion of walking as being part of the memory experience of engaging the monument. So Southern Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, has a history of what they call ghost structures, which are former structures that are associated with slavery, whether they're slave cabins or housing or whatever it might be. And so the university did archaeological work and discovered that there was, of course, slave labor tied to St. Mary's College. How could it not be? But they found archaeological presence on their playing field, on their major space where they're about to build a stadium. So they have commissioned this memorial that does some of the things Courtney says, so that you kind of walk down this long pathway, and it is a structure of a cabin that looks like a wood slave cabin, but it has mirrored surface that's called erasure poetry on it. That is, in fact, poetry that's reclaimed out of ads for people advertising so they can reclaim their enslaved person, right? So slave advertisements. But there's also slave narratives that are on this. Now, the thing about the structure that's so interesting is you walk around it. It's a building, it's a structure, but because of the way it has mirrored surfaces, there's a constant changing of the surface quality because of the environment and because of the light. And so it feels like it's both there and not there. It means that you sometimes can read the writing on the side of the building. Sometimes you cannot. It has a total light show at night that projects the writing into the landscape in really interesting ways. So the words become part of the archaeological site. To me, this is an incredibly successful monument, right? That was one of our, kind of questions. It's a monument, but it is a memorial, because I can go there and think about that history, that kind of historic presence of slavery in the landscape at St. Mary's College. And it's just one example of what I think, and it's a design. So I want to say it's a design group. It is not a traditional monument builders who did this who won the commission. So I've actually noticing in the last 5 years, there are design groups, design practitioners who have a really different approach rather than artists or sculptors or monument builders. It just seems that there's a different kind of feel for space and for that idea of the participatory nature, right, of a memorial space. So
I would agree. It ends up Mass Art is this firm which I know was at the heart of designing the Memorial in Montgomery, the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. And they do it very quietly, but always as a group. And they've apparently been kind of essential to all these other projects that we keep hearing about. And very quietly, they're kind of this group doing all this work.
I think Mass Group is so important for the work they did down at the National Memorial for Slavery and Justice, because there's something really interesting that happens there. It's not just a lynching memorial. It is, in fact, the long array of racial violence that is realized at that site. So you start with slavery. You learn about the end of the Civil War. All of this even before you enter the memorial proper. Right. And then as one exits, as one walks through those Cortine I say the Cortine steel bodies, but they're boxes, and you exit, you then see mass incarceration. But what that monument, I think, again, is one of the more effective as opposed to ineffective memorialization efforts. It asks communities across the United States to take responsibility, right? That's the justice work, to take responsibility for the violence that was enacted in your community in the past, but also, I think that Brian Stevenson would say in the present, right, through police violence. So there's multiple things happening at that site. And so I do see it as a very kind of astonishing monument memorial in its work. Yeah.
That brilliant stroke of every one of those Corten steel duplicates that's kind of lying, stacked in the garden when you leave, is one that has not been claimed by the county named on it to be taken back to that county and installed as a memorial to the lynchings that happened in that county. So he's demanding that this actually memory be dispersed, and that counties come and own the memory of the lynchings and take responsibility for the memory. They don't have to take responsibility for the lynching. Take responsibility for the memory of the lynching, which is what he's built into that design, which is unbelievable.
And I think only what's even more amazing is I only think 2 or 3 counties have done this work, right? So it's going to be a long process for that graveyard, so to speak, where all the steles are now laying on their sides, to actually, and some of them will never leave, which actually says its own story about the failure of or the desire not to remember, to forget. I guess to forget, but really not to remember.
You're right.
Well, it's an interesting relationship to call and response just with history. So, Renee, I really respect your idea for this pause on building more monuments as a moment for reflection, but I see a real need for these counter monuments, or these conversations about what the dominant society has told us, those narratives, and who has not had the opportunity to speak. So I think there's a lot of richness and responding and relating to the existing monuments. My husband a while ago did a really cool project on monuments that had me thinking about our relationship. So it was looking at the Visigoths sacking Rome and tearing down monuments and vandalizing them, and really thinking about this relationship between vandals and those that erect monuments, between those that have the power to choose what's represented in society and those that choose to take it down, and everything in between. So I think there's a lot of space beyond those that just choose to put new monuments up.
Yeah. Raphael?
I think Renee was saying the pause is for monuments, not counter monuments. That counter monuments are really necessary, so anti-monuments as well. But I do think it's interesting to consider the need that we have in public space for a place for assembly, other than a shopping mall, which has norms of conduct that have to do, basically they're hurting our capability as a democratic society to express ourselves. So the way I think of it is sometimes the metaphor of the fountain is a really good one. I really love fountains because traditionally we think of a fountain as a congregation place. Crucially, it's a congregation place where you would get water, right? So anybody from any class would come together at this place with water. There's a sense of abundance, and it was always the center of all social contact, right? So thinking of monuments as fountains of congregation spaces, there's Ronald Rael, who is one of the people who did the seesaws across the US-Mexico border. I'm sure you saw them, this beautiful pink seesaws. They talk about the border not as a place for people to be divided, but as a place for people to come together. So I really, when I get optimistic and I get all utopian, I really think that there is a fundamental role for a public landmark that helps people congregate, assemble. The great American composer Frederick Chevsky talked about the most important objective of art is for people coming together. And though that sounds super, hippie, I'm for that. I think that is what we need at a time when we're all, just in our own bubbles of information and so on. How do we create a condition for a connection with somebody from a disparate background than us and create cohesion? I'm a nerd, as you can see by my shirt. This is a history of computers. And for example, I noticed that the monument of today is these cameras, surveillance cameras everywhere, tracking everything, doing all the metrics. What if instead of cameras, we had projectors? What if instead of taking images away from us and assuming suspicions, the artists somehow would project images for us to have an excuse to interrupt the normal narratives of our usage of the city, to come together to speak of this interruption? I think that's what an artist can or should do in public space, is interrupt those normal narratives and provide a platform for people to talk to each other.
Right. You come back to this question of the need for a gathering. The very idea of music for some composers is the gathering, and that's the point. And if the idea of the memorial spaces is to gather, then that brings us back to the question: how do we then commemorate the victims of a virus that prevents us from gathering? And,
and I would say that
we're searching for the alternatives, but you're coming up with them.
I would say that Bobby Lefebvre did an incredible job. I mean, I still think getting goosepimples of the performance that he just did to open this thing, because that is the right vehicle. This panel has chosen the right vehicle to communicate the gravity and the enormity of the different obstacles and the loss, but then also just to think about it in a way that we can make sense of it. So Montaigne said that to philosophize is to learn how to die. I think it's the same with art. Like in art, we're just all trying to figure out the fact that we're all going to die. And then we're just all trying to think about, well, how can we, infect and leave a legacy and make a contribution? That is really what art making is. So not just philosophy. And I think that Bobby's, I want to commend this panel for starting with him because the voice and the heartfelt, sort of string of words just affects us in a way that I think is the most effective and most purest form, even though there's controversy about that. But I really do believe poets are in a league of their own. Bastards. They're so good. And then when you think about Amanda, so I hadn't heard of Amanda Gorman, right? Until the Biden, opening, the how do you say in English? The Biden
inauguration.
So Amanda Gorman comes in, she speaks. I mean, this is humanity, right? Like this is just penetrating everybody in the most effective way. So when you were saying about music, the same with spoken word, right? Like here is a person speaking to you. You don't know them. You're listening. How can we create structures of listening? That's what I think is.
When I in the old days, teaching poetry. Always taught it and required that the students read it aloud to themselves at home, or that their roommate read it aloud. The poetry doesn't exist if it's not read aloud and vocalized. And in class, we always made everybody read the poem we were about to say. Robert Frost used to say, somebody would say, "Oh, I love this poem of yours." He goes, "Oh, can you say it?" And if you love it, then you have to be able to say it as well. So poems can do things that conventional memorials can't. So when we make a poem kind of a memorial act, we've actually expanded what a memorial can do. Then we can make a memorial a spoken word as well. So this is Bobby's poem will live on now. I can't wait to see him read it again.
And, I think, Raphael, I love this idea of congregation spaces. And it's something I've been talking about a little bit, that we need more. I keep thinking like contemplative spaces, or spaces that allow us to communicate in civil ways. But I've also been interested in this thing called the talking park bench as a place that if you sit there, you decide that you're going to engage in conversation, and that conversation can possibly be hard. It can possibly be about grief, but you're making that community connection by sitting on that bench. And I think we need more spaces like that, where we can actually deliberately go to a place and relate to each other and talk to each other about these really hard issues, and particularly about loss and mourning. That the idea of the talking park bench, or Toni Morrison's bench by the road, which was dedicated very specifically there around the South to slavery, but also that we can start having hard conversations about the past at these spaces as well.
It's really nice. I see Robin trying to come in. Robin, would you like to add anything? Or
I just wanted to come in here and say that, this has been an incredible conversation. And personally, I wanted to ask a question, maybe as sort of a wrap up, to say, when you visit a future COVID memorial, or a future memorial that is constructed to some level of community grief, what is it you would hope that these memorials take into consideration, or what is it you would hope that you would take away from that experience of visiting this sort of future memorial that has yet to be constructed or conceived?
We'll go around. Courtney, why don't you start?
I think for me, it's simply authenticity. I want to see something that makes me have a visceral response. I want to connect with other perspectives. I want time to digest. And I think it's those simple things. I do think there's a lot of abstraction because this pandemic is global. And I think it's hard to really wrap your head around that impact. And yeah, so I think it's quite simple, authenticity.
Nice. Renee, any thoughts?
I think, in particularly when I think about COVID, which is the subject of this, I think in some ways it's connected to Courtney, but this idea of quiet space of reflection, that you can enter a space that allows you to mourn. I think all of us, whether we realize it, I would say that all of us are going through mourning right now. This has been a remarkably difficult year, and I think that space of reflection. And I would also say, whether it's projections or it's temporary. But I do believe in the power of naming. I think calling the dead is really important. It's part of almost of every religious tradition we can imagine. And we've not had the space to call the dead. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. Raphael, any thoughts? We're good.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would say fragility. The idea that we're alive now, we feel invincible, and then a microscopic organism just, puts all of us to observe this moment of passing. A lot of people have died unnecessarily. These premature deaths are a big wound, but that fragility needs to be kept as something that we remember, because we act, especially politically, in completely unreasonable ways to support life on this planet. So if we can, we should understand that the atmosphere tried to kill us, and it's going to try again, because we are a virus that needs to be eradicated from the point of view of millions of years of the Earth's history. So we need to be humbled. We need to be attentive to this phenomena. We need to be, just understand that, like Montaigne said, we're gonna die. So remember to treasure the time that we have in the planet. That's what I would like to remember.
Thank you. Robin, I couldn't say anything better.
Yes, thank you so much. I would love to just thank all of you for being here today and for sharing this space and for sharing your wisdom with us, and to Bobby for his poem at the beginning of our conversation. And I also would just like to thank all of our community partners who have supported the COVID Memorial project that we launched earlier in March, and to invite all of our viewers to check it out on our website as we begin the next phases of this project, as we start to invite the public to submit conceptual drawings for what they might imagine a COVID memorial dedicated to the Americas might look like. So thank you to our partners in this project, to Reimagine for hosting the registration of this event, and to our coffee chat sponsor, Greenberg Traurig. And finally, I just wanted to end with probably my favorite part of Bobby's poem that I think really captures what you all do and these thoughts around memorials. But for me, this really stood out, the part where he said, "Let us be both the memory and the imagination, the stewards of bridging yesterday to tomorrow." So we think that for me, if I was to walk into a space or to experience a memorial, that feeling of bridging the loss of yesterday into the future of tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope everyone has a lovely Friday afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Thank you for letting us gather with you.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, everybody.